Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
So, welcome Tom. Tom Crompton is a change strategist at WWF UK. He's worked in the environmental movement for 15 years and has recently shifted rather away from focusing directly on environmental policy to looking at the issue of engagement with the environmental challenge, particularly from social sciences. So, welcome Tom, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thanks. Thank you and hello. So I've been asked to give a few reflections on Bill's talk, which I found fascinating. And I suppose where it led me to was to ask myself the question, well, what are the fundamental barriers to us moving towards the type of society that Bill so clearly painted a picture of? Can it happen entirely through what you might think of, I suppose, as being a sort of demand-led shift of people acquiring as individuals the appetite to live in the type of way that Bill was outlining? To some extent that has to be true, but also, as Bill also underscored, there has to be something more obligatory about it, I suppose. It has to be a role for international agreement, it has to be a role for policy frameworks, it has to be a role for political engagement on those issues. So, what might some of those engagements be? Well, Bill talks about the need to price carbon properly, the need to begin to incorporate the full costs of the stuff that we consume into the full environmental costs, into what we actually pay for them. There's a series of more arcane interventions that you might make. So I used to work on international trade policy, WTO law, for WWF for about 5 years or so, and we worked on stuff like non-product related processing and production methods, which sound absolutely opaque and arcane, as indeed they were, but may be quite important here because those are the rules under international trade obligations that prevent a country deciding that it's going to discriminate at the point of import of a particular product, dependent on how those products are produced. If they're produced in a more sustainable way, for example, the trade system is absolutely blind to that. All the trade system looks at is what are the inherent characteristics of this product. So we trundle along to these big WTO meetings, a small team of us alongside a lot of other NGOs, and we lobby trade officials on these issues. And many of those trade officials were personally deeply convinced of the need for the type of changes that we were advocating. But would say, well, look, quite frankly, our hands are tied. There simply isn't the political space, there isn't the political capital for us to begin to contemplate enacting the type of changes to the international trading regime that you're saying is necessary, and that, quite frankly, in the case of some of these officials, they agreed was necessary. So, faced with that, of course, what they say is, well, you as NGOs, you as civil society need to go out and create more public pressure. We need to feel that there's an increased public appetite for the types of changes that you're asking for, because there's no simply political space to enact them. And it certainly wasn't the case that the eyes of the world were on these negotiations. Quite understandably, most people were completely disinterested by them. A situation which I imagine is paralleled a lot by negotiations around climate change, where, although there are more people engaged in that, there's a more vociferous public engagement with those issues, nonetheless, the pressure that public engagement creates isn't in any way proportional to the scale of political change which is actually needed. It doesn't present sufficient motivation to carry forward those political changes. So that obliged us really to sort of fall back on asking, well, okay, so it's all very well us investing our time and energy and resources and going along and trying to dot the I's and cross the T's or tweak the details of this particular piece of policy, which we see as being important, quite rightly I think, as being important in terms of moving towards the sort of society that Bill was envisaging. But if we don't have the political capital for that, if the politicians simply aren't if the politicians don't have the resources of public appetite for those changes upon which to draw, then we're blowing in the wind. I suppose you use the metaphor. We're blowing in the wind. So what response might we make to that? What is it, in essence, that underpins people caring, people's expression of care, and what is it that underpins their their willingness to actually engage in behaviour in line with the things that they care about. What is it that motivates people to go to Washington, dressed up in a suit and tie, and risk arrest in order to campaign, to lobby on an issue related to climate change? So we asked social psychologists for their answer to that question, and the social psychologist said, well, there's one thing that it strikes us that civil society at the moment seems to be largely ignoring, and that's the importance of values. As we see it, many civil society campaigns are very savvy, very politically attuned in terms of recognising the particular political levers that they might pull, the particular issues that do carry political momentum, on which the environmental or climate change agenda can be hitched, domestic energy security, or when it comes to investment in renewables, national economic competitiveness, we need to get the competitive edge in order to, we ought to be investing in renewables early so we maintain that competitive edge. So there are undoubtedly political priorities to which at times the environmental imperative can be hit, but actually, the psychologists argue, may at times be counterproductive. May at times be the case that you're serving through those campaigns to reinforce precisely those values which actually undermine public commitment to environmental issues, public concern about those issues, and their willingness to engage in behaviour in line with those. And you can kind of see that. I mean, Bill, I did some of my homework and I read your most recent book, and there is a line in there where I think you can see that the Alaskan Independence Party, were they to embrace wholeheartedly the agenda of local energy security, would drill every square inch of the tundra, and the caribou and the planet's climate could go hang. So we can see that there are dangers in appealing to what may, in opportunistic terms, be quite the most opportune values or political priorities to which to appeal. So I just want to say something about values and how they relate to one another, and the implications of that both for civil society and also, I think, for religious groups, for faith-based responses to these challenges. So there are two aspects to our values and the way in which those values interact that I want to tell you about. First is the extent to which the values that we hold tend to the extent that we hold those values to be important, and to the extent that they're activated through things in the environment, through the stuff we read, through the stuff that we hear that people tell us, through our experience of public policy, through our experience of an infrastructure, through our experience of moving around our home place, some of those values are related. And in activating one, you can activate others. So there's good evidence, you'll be relieved to hear, that activating values around community tends also to increase the priority that people place on values around environmental issues. If people who lend tools to their neighbours are more likely to express concern about global environmental issues, more likely to be concerned about climate change. So there is a link there, certainly not inevitable, and there are reasons why that link may not always operate. But broadly speaking, those values of community that Bill was placing so much emphasis on are aligned, are consistent with those values of concern about more global environmental issues, to which ultimately we're going to have to appeal if we're going to foresee people stepping up to engage in the type of political activity that Bill was calling for. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that there are other values which are actually opposed to those values, and these tend to operate in a seesaw type fashion. So those values, we call them intrinsic values, those values of my sense of connection to my community, my sense of place, my sense of what the psychologists call mature love for my friends and family, my sense of unity with nature. Those intrinsic values are in opposition, operate in opposition to a set of extrinsic values, which I hold, which everybody holds, which are concerns about wealth and social status and prestige, and those are kind of in a seesaw, if you like. So there are some really neat experiments, which I don't have time to go into, but you activate one set of values around achievement and concerns about wealth, those values come up, And what you find is that inadvertently, people's concern about environmental values diminishes. And you ask them inadvertently, you provide them with an opportunity to do something which is pro-environmental, maybe, or pro-social. So maybe, having participated in the study, you ask them as they leave, would they like to, you give them £5 for participating, would they like to donate some of that £5 to an environmental charity, seemingly unconnected to the study. And if you've activated those extrinsic values, those concerns about money or wealth or social status, they're far less likely to make a donation. They're less likely to help an experimenter who accidentally knocks over a bucket of pencils. They're less likely to recycle scrap paper. So the seesaw relationship between values. And what that leads to, I think, is to ask, in envisaging how are we going to build that type of political momentum that we need if we're to move towards, if we're to sprint towards the future that Bill anticipated. We're not going to do that by rooting our appeals for pro-environmental behaviour, pro-climate behaviour, in appeals which activate those extrinsic values, in appeals which hook those behaviours to the drive for social status or competitiveness or energy security. And simultaneously to be making the environmental case or to promoting those behaviours, we need to be working to strengthen those intrinsic values. And also, collectively, we need to begin to work to undermine those causes which are strengthening the unhelpful extrinsic values, because to the extent those become more important, it's diminishing people's concern about the environmental values, diminishing their motivation to go and engage in the type of political interventions Bill was talking about. So what might some of those be? Some of those prompts which drive us towards increasing the importance we attach towards extrinsic values? Well, there's very good evidence that advertising, particularly the pervasiveness of advertising. Estimates vary, but we see something like between 500 or 600 up to some estimates 3,000 advertisements a day. Most of those advertisements are conveying the impression that we can feel more happy in ourselves, that we'll command more social respect, that if we buy this particular product, the product is in some sense an indication of our success, reinforcing in a drip fashion the importance of the intrinsic values. You heard yesterday about political economic priorities, and particularly there as well, political rhetoric, in terms of the emphasis that places on competitiveness and economic success. Again, reinforcing, activating, and therefore reinforcing those values. Values are kind of like a muscle. The more you use them, or the more you're activating them, the stronger they become. And the media, of course, Alan Sugar, Jeremy Clarkson, Sex in the City 2, all examples of media which simultaneously help to reinforce those values, which are absolutely counter to those upon which we're going to need to build this future. There's one study which these values can be plotted on circles, opposing values on opposite sides. There's one study that suggests the separation between community feeling and concern about financial success is 191 degrees, 180 degrees being perfect opposition. Very strong oppositional nature between these things. So this leads me to the implications of this, which is that I think there's an opportunity here for us to be building a far wider and more powerful common cause, right across not just civil society groups, but also faith-based groups. Any group that has any concern about a set of social and environmental issues. I've talked mainly about the values which underpin environmental concern, but it's equally true about the values which underpin expression of concern about social exclusion or discrimination between people on the basis of race or gender or sexuality or ethnicity, whatever. A very wide range of problems which you might, I suppose, think of as being bigger than self problems, right? Problems which it's not necessarily in your immediate self-interest to engage with, are underpinned by importantly by the extent to which people value these intrinsic values. So there's an opportunity there for civil society organisations to come together, irrespective of whether they're working on rights for disabled people, or gay rights, or, I don't know, donkey welfare, to come together and recognise that each of their agendas are simultaneously going to be better propelled forward to the extent that they work in unison to begin to root their campaigns in ways which are going to help to strengthen those intrinsic values. And simultaneously, they may come together as well and begin to work in a more concerted way to tackle some of those drivers of the opposing extrinsic values. How many environmental organisations had anything to say about media consolidation, or about the recent introduction in the UK of product placement in editorial content in television? We were, as far as I know, silent about it, as were many other organisations. But irrespective of the issues on which we work, we may have found common cause in recognising that an issue like that is of totemic importance in stemming this tide of the increasing extent to which those extrinsic values are emphasised. So to finish, what I want to urge is that if we're to foresee a shift towards the type of future that Bill was anticipating, then that will be because we transcend our differences about issues, and we avoid the temptation to become embroiled in detailed debate about the issues. We rather recognise that right across the third sector, and I suggest as well, although it's not an area I know well, right across faith-based organisations, we recognise that our concerns, all our concerns, are going to be best propelled forward by seeking ways to strengthen those intrinsic values through the campaigns that we run, and to work to diminish the importance we attach to those extrinsic values. Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to invite Satish Kumar now to offer some reflections on Bill's presentation. Satish will be known to many of us, I guess, through his work with Resurgence and as an advocate of the work and teachings of Schumacher, not least through the Schumacher College. I've been following Satish's work now for, 20 or 30 years, and I've always been impressed by the narratives he talks about and the embeddedness in his whole life of the beliefs that he follows through in his daily practice. So welcome indeed, Satish.
Thank you. I was delighted to be present in the talk by Bill McKibben. He is one of our great writer, thinker, and activist, which is a very rare combination. So it was a great honor and pleasure to hear him. And one of his great books, which was perhaps the first book, as far as I know, was The End of Nature. And that book inspired many, many people, including myself. And one of the questions which was presented here was the disconnection between sort of our economy and ecology. And that, I think, is perhaps the most fundamental problem of our time, that disconnection. Not long ago, I was invited to speak at LSE. And when I arrived there, I asked the London professor who was going to chair my session, was a lady, and I asked her, what is your department for ecology? You know what the answer was? We don't have one. I said, this is the disconnection. They are teaching economy and having no concern, no department for ecology. I said to the audience when I was speaking there, I said, do you know the meaning of the word economy and ecology? These are three Greek words: ekos, logos, nomos. Ekos means home. And in the great wisdom of the Greek philosophers, ekos, home, is not only where you live and you have your bedroom, bathroom, living room, kitchen, etc., garden, but home goes further than your living room and bedroom. entire planet is our home. The earth home. And logos means knowledge of home. So ecology means knowledge. And what is a home? Home is a place of relationships. So all our species upon this earth are related. We are all related. We are all kith and kin. The birds flying in the sky are my relations, brothers and sisters, like St. Francis. He was the first great ecologist, patron saint of ecology. So, logos means knowledge. The economy, nomos, nomos means management. Management of household, management of your home, planet home, earth home. Now I asked the students and the professors of LSE in my talk, I asked them, please tell me, how are you going to manage your home if you don't know it? Can you manage something without knowing? So no wonder you are sending thousands upon thousands of half-educated graduates around the world to manage the economy. No wonder that the world economy is a mess. What do you expect if you have half-educated people, highly half-educated, like half-baked bread? If you eat half-baked bread, what do you have? Indigestion. So our world economy is having indigestion. And so that is the disconnection. We need to reconnect. And that is, I think, the great message and the great theme of Bill's entire work. That we need to reconnect and understand that the human beings are as much part of nature as the nature out there. Nature is not just there, out there, the trees, the rivers, the Thames River, the birds, the forests, the mountains. We are nature too. Another meaning of the word, like ecology and economy, we have to understand the meaning of the word nature. The word nature means to be born. Natura. When a mother is pregnant, she goes for prenatal check. After the birth, she goes for postnatal check. The word natal, native, nature, nativity, they are all related. As you good Christians already know, we have nativity play at Christmas time. So nativity and nature come from the same Latin root. So are we not born? How can we say we are not nature, nature is out there? That is the disconnection. But the moment we realize that we are nature, and what we do to nature out there, we do to ourselves. Nature does not belong to us. We belong to nature. That is the fundamental reconnection that I think Bill's message and Bill's books are about. And if we can reconnect with nature in that way, then there's no dualism. There's no separation. There's no superiority of human beings. We say, we are the humans, like imperial power. It's a human empire that we have built. And all the natural world out there is for our benefit. The animals are for us. We can do what we like with them. Put them in factory farms. Eat as much meat as you like. Morning, lunchtime, evening, 7 days a week. Cruel treatment of animals. What we do to rainforest, cut them down. We want more agriculture, we want more meat, we want more McDonald's to spread. We can cut down the rainforest. We can do the fishing as we like in the oceans. We can do, I can go on. You read Bill's book, End of Nature, and you will get it all there. It's all there. So this dualism needs to be brought to an end. What I, as a Jain, I come from a Jain background, my religious background, we have a principle of non-violence. Ahimsa, we call it. Ahimsa is compassion and kindness to all living beings, what Albert Schweitzer called reverence for all life. At the moment, we have lost that reverence. I want to establish what I would call reverential ecology, which goes a little further than deep ecology. And I was speaking with my friend, passed away, late Arne Ness, who talked about deep ecology. I said, deep is good, but not necessarily good. You can be a deep hole. So, reverential ecology is we need to cultivate deep reverence for all life out there in nature. The moment we have that reverential ecology and we have a respect for ecology, then there is abundance there in nature. We can receive the gifts of nature and celebrate nature, celebrate the gift of nature, enjoy the gift of nature. At this moment, the autumn and the apple season, we can have abundant apples, as much as you like. I'm an orchard keeper. I have 2.5 acres, 15 apple trees, and I make juice every day. Fresh apple juice, nectar. If you have not tasted the real English Somerset, Dorset, Devon apple juice, you are missing something. Don't eat this golden delicious. Neither they are golden nor delicious. And so that reconnection, the point was raised in this previous set of wonderful, many good points, but that touched me, that reconnection with the natural world, and following the example of St. Francis. If you are good Christians there, I think he was the saint who was true ecologist. First ecologist, I think, among the Christians, maybe some others too, but I don't know. So we need to follow that, and if we follow that, then I think we can redesign the world. This industrial civilization is very fragile. It cannot last. Just look at the world going through this debt crisis, the economic crisis, and they are all in a turmoil. Such a fragile system, and nobody knows how to solve this problem. G20, European Union, Sarkozy, Merkel, Cameron, Obama, they are all completely incompetent. They don't know how to solve the problem. They cannot solve the problem. Because if you disconnect from ecology, economy cannot be solved. And it's not even economy, it's just a financial bubble. And Anne Pettifor is the expert. And you will hear, and you have heard already what she has talked about. This money system, money is not wealth. Simple and clear. All these bankers are not wealth creators, they are wealth destroyers. Money is not wealth. The real wealth is nature. The land, labor, capital, that was the old classic economy. We have forgotten the land. Where is the land? Just a commodity to buy and sell and invest. We have forgotten people. Just capital, capital, capital. So we need to say money is not wealth, money is only a measure of wealth. The real wealth is nature, land, animals, good water, good air, human creativity, human imagination, communities, our skills. All these things we have to restore. So this is a great challenge for the churches, for the religious people, and the change will not come from 10 Downing Street. The leadership will not come from the White House. We have a great expectation from Obama. I was in New York at that time, and in America at that time, when he was fighting for nomination. I had a great hope. I had read his book, Audacity of Hope. The moment he went into the White House, he lost audacity. Where is that audacity? Where is that courage? Where is that fearlessness? So I am saying to you, change will not come from the White House or 10 Downing Street. Change will come from the leaders of this room. You are the leaders. We have to build that campaign. We have to build that movement. And that is what Bill is doing. He was in jail, arrested because of his action. So that is the true leadership, and I congratulate him, and I congratulate you who are leading this great transition and transformation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Satish. And our third speaker this morning is Ruth Valerio. I came across Ruth, first of all, when seeing her book, Ellie's for Lifestyle, Christian Living That Doesn't Cost the Earth. And Ruth is currently doing a PhD at King's College London, looking at simplicity as a Christian response to consumerism. I'm tempted to say that I felt compelled to study voluntary simplicity, but I found it too complex. But yeah, it's one side at the moment. So it's a great delight to welcome you, Ruth, to present to us this morning.
Brilliant, thank you, Tim, and thank you for inviting me. It's really, I hope you've been enjoying this morning as much as I have. And Bill, can I just say it's a real privilege for me to be standing up here, because I'm one, I think probably most of us here, who have been reading your books throughout the last however many number of years. So it's great to be here after what you were doing earlier. Thank you. And thank you for what you said about the difference between people who are normal and people who are radical, because that really spoke to me, because I've spent the last 15 or who knows how many years being the one who is a bit weird, being the one who lives their life slightly differently to everybody else, to my friends and my family around me, and being told that I'm weird and that I'm not normal. And I've spent those 15 years telling them that no, actually I'm normal. I live my life in a way that is a normal way to live in this earth that we live on, and actually you're weird because the way you live is a weird way in relation to the way that this earth lives. So it was really encouraging to hear that backed up. Thank you. I want to start off with this quote that I came across a few weeks ago with some reading that I was doing for my doctorate. And Christine Hinzer said, "Economic justice requires both good institutions and virtuous actors. That is, people who are habituated to proper judgments, desires and practices." And that quote seemed to me to sum up a lot of what we have been discussing over this last couple of days that we've been together. There's been an implicit and sometimes a bit more of an explicit debate going on around actually who is responsible. Who is going to take responsibility? Who is going to act? Is it business? Is it government? Is it individuals? We had a bit of a debate over that last night, didn't we? Where does responsibility lie? And this quote for me brings all of that together in that we all have to take responsibility. We can't look at government and say you've got to do it. We can't look at individuals and say it's your fault for the way you're living. We have to work together. Good institutions or institutions require virtuous actors who will encourage the institutions to be good. And actors require good institutions that will help them to be more virtuous, because a lot of what we are enabled to do comes from what the institutions enable us to do, as we've been hearing about. And over our last couple of sessions, I think we've heard a lot about the institutions, and we've heard a fair amount about some of the things that we should be doing and how we should be living. And I want to suggest that alongside that question of what's the right thing to do is a really crucial question of what sort of person should I be. And I was really heartened to hear Tom bring in this idea of values, and some of these words have been coming through. And I want to look at the concept of virtue. Going back to that quote, I think all of us here are called to be virtuous actors. And we will be enabled to do the things that we want to do, and our institutions will be enabled to be good if we are able to take on some of the classic virtues that many of our faith traditions have talked about and become virtuous actors. I haven't got time to go in depth into a lot of those virtues, but I want to pick up on 4 that I think are really crucial. The first virtue where I would start, and I think we need to start as a conference together, is humility. Humility is about knowing our place. It's knowing who we are. And we've forgotten that, haven't we? Satish was talking about that. We have forgotten that we are a part of nature. Coming from my Christian tradition, we have forgotten that we are a part of creation. When we've talked about creation, creation has been everything else except for ourselves. Somehow, I don't know how we ever got into that understanding. In secular language, we talk about the environment. I hate that word. The environment is like this stage that human actors play their lives out on, rather than it being something that we are all a part of. We are part of what Richard Walker would describe as being the community of creation. We're not separate from it. We are part of it. We are finite. And we are, for me, from my Christian background, we are here to be servants of the rest of what God has made. I think that's what Genesis 1:26-28 means. That idea of dominion, of domination. It's about kingship, about kingly rule. How were the kings to rule? They were to be servants. We are here, not as the lords of creation, we are here as the servants of everything else that has been made. That is our place. So we start with humility. Humility teaches us to say, we don't have all the answers. If that's one thing that's come through from our sessions together, it's that actually we don't know. And we don't have the answers because we are finite. And we have to start from that position of humility, which means that we exercise caution in everything that we do, rather than rushing on and thinking that we know the way ahead. Secondly, I was thrilled to hear Bill talk about this earlier, frugality. Different, I think, to austerity. We hear about austerity, don't we? But we don't hear about this word frugality. It's not part of our culture. You know, why shouldn't I have strawberries and asparagus in January, if that's what I want? Why shouldn't I have white veal, if that's what I want? We're taught to expect to have what we want when we want. And if humility is about knowing our place and our limitations, then I think frugality is about knowing the earth's limitations and about learning to live within the limitations of living on one planet. And of course there are all sorts of debates about that, aren't there, which is what we're here to do. How do we actually do that? What will it look like? Well, we know whatever it looks like doesn't look like how we're living now. And frugality, I think, is something that needs to come into our language as a virtue that we take on. If I had time, I would love to look at the virtue of generosity, which to me balances out frugality, because I think generosity is also a really important virtue to take on board, generosity for others, but I'm not going to go into that. But we look at the manna in Exodus 16, we look at the Lord's Prayer, and we are taught that we should ask just for enough, and we should live on enough, however we might define that. Frugality, a key thing that we need to recover today. And then justice. We will know, I'm sure, that justice runs like a thread throughout the whole biblical narrative. As far as I'm concerned, you can't be a Christian, you can't be a follower of Jesus without being concerned for issues of justice. Justice for other people, justice for the land that we are a part of. Justice is a central part of what it means to be a Christian. I'm sure many of you here know of the old classic Jim Wallace story of a friend of his when he was at college who took his Bible and ripped out all of the pages that talk about poverty or the poor, that talk about justice, and when he'd finished ripping it out, he had this very threadbare Bible left with not much that was in it. And Jim Wallace borrowed his friend's Bible, and he used to travel around churches saying, look, this is what you live, this is what you preach. It's a holy Bible that's full of holes, because if justice isn't a natural part of who we are, then actually, for me, we're not living out our lives from my background as a follower of Jesus. And it's the justice virtue that picks up on a lot of what Bill was talking about and pushes us out from just concentrating on the individual things, the, you know, light bulbs, etc., carrier bags, all of that kind of stuff, as important and as crucial as they are, and I spend a lot of my time writing and talking about those things, but it's justice that pushes us out from that and says, you've got to get involved in what's happening in your world. We've got to be people who are involved in every level, in our communities, in our churches, in our nation, in the EU, on a global level. We need to know what's happening. We need to be having our say. We need to be taking part. We need to be doing the direct action things. We can't just be content with doing the individual actions in our lives. And then finally, I think all of this is undergirded by the virtue of love. I'm sure you know, it's a bit of a truism, that the opposite of love isn't hate, but it's apathy. Literally, apathy, without love, without feeling. Where you have no love, you have no feeling, and therefore you have no action. One of my favourite verses in the Bible is Proverbs 12:10, that in my translation says, a righteous person cares for the needs of their animal. Actually, the Hebrew of that is a righteous person knows the soul of their animals. What a wonderful description. They know it in that, not quite in that biblical sense, but that concept of knowing, of intimacy, of knowledge, when you know someone deeply. That connection that comes from knowing the land that you live on. And that fosters love. If you don't know, if you don't love, then you won't act. Action comes from love. And so for me, love isn't an airy-fairy sentiment, a nice virtue to talk about on a platform. Love actually is the key thing that leads to action, that leads to us having to do things. And so what we're talking about here for me isn't just about our duties or our responsibilities. If we talk about duty and responsibility, we're not going to get anywhere, are we? Because I don't know about you, but that doesn't switch me on. But love and intimacy actually is what makes me want to do something and what makes me want to act. So I want to leave you with those virtues, and there are others that if I had more time we could have looked at as well. And those virtues kind of frame for me how I live my life. I carry in my purse one of those good fish guides. You know, when I go to the fish counter, I can pull it out. I think it's the MSC, and they've produced this thing. I can pull it out and have a look at the fish I want to buy, and it helps inform my purchasing decisions as to whether or not I'll buy this type of fish or that type of fish. Well, these virtues that we've been going through, I want to carry them around in the same way. So every day, through the different ways that I live and the different choices that I find in front of me, I want to ask, this thing I'm going to do, is this a humble thing? Am I living in a humble way? Am I demonstrating frugality? Am I demonstrating generosity? Am I being generous through my actions? Am I being just through what I'm doing? Who or what is benefiting from this particular purchase that I'm going to make or this particular action that I'm going to take? Is it fair? Am I being courageous? Am I being hopeful in what I'm doing? And then am I being loving? Through the way that I live, am I demonstrating love? Love to God, love to other people around me, love to the world that I inhabit. And so I hope that's a helpful framework for us as we go forward. Thank you.
So thank you all of you for some really excellent presentations and insights from different but very complementary perspectives. And now we have just over half an hour to take questions, comments, discussions and thoughts. Who wants to kick off? To the back, right at the very back first. She's back.
It's Paul Young, Newcastle University. I've enjoyed all the presentations this morning, all being terrific. Thanks very much for that. There's just one point that I wanted to raise though, because it seemed some things that Bill said about, what he'd like to do instead of going around the world, spending time at this place in Vermont, which sounds great. What Satish was saying about his apple orchard. Just sort of brought to my mind the issue of why I'm absolutely in sympathy with the idea of reconnecting, with ecology and so on, in the way that Satish was saying. What's our message really for the vast majority of people who live in dense urban areas for whom, a direct reconnection with nature in that way isn't really on the cards now, and is not going to be on the cards in 2050 when 75% of the human population is living in concrete jungles. And if we take a Pol Pot view and say, well, kick them all out into the countryside won't stand it, I'm afraid. So we do have a bit of a dilemma, and I'm absolutely fired up by everything I've heard, but what's our message for the urban poor and the concrete jungles and all of this?
Yes, I understand that you can't send everybody in the country, but we can bring country in the city. At the moment, our cities are very badly planned. They are concrete jungles. There is no conflict between nature and culture. We need to bring allotments, gardens, more trees. Every house, every office building, every business headquarters should be built with trees around them, ponds around them. So you can have less buildings and more nature. At the moment we are building more and more and more. And a lot of buildings are highly underused. They are quarter used, half used, 1/3 used. So we need to have less buildings and more nature in the cities. And also, we need to do less hours in our offices, closed in. And we need to have maybe 3 or 4 days a week in the work, and maybe 3 days at least per weekend. So people can go walking in nature. Unless you are in nature, you know nature, you are not going to reconnect. Knowing nature through the films of David Attenborough, or even Satish Kumar's film, is not enough. You have to go and experience nature. So that way, you can find a balance between the two. You don't have to send everybody in the country and live there, maybe not enough space. But bring nature into city and bring people walking in nature, learning from nature, not learning about nature, which we generally do in our universities, but learning from nature. That way we can reconnect.
Thank you. I'm not going to pass the mic around, but if anyone can't hear, just raise your hand and I will, otherwise it's going to get very cumbersome moving to person. Bill, you wanted to respond?
Just to follow up on what Satish was saying, there are cities and there are cities in a sense, and two of the best ways to reconnect nature of various kinds into the urban experience that we're beginning to really see are food. It makes preeminent sense, and it's really beginning to happen, at least in the States, that this sort of local food revolution is coming directly into the cities. New York City has now dozens of these farmers markets around it, and tens of thousands of people, if not hundreds of thousands, who are subscribing to these community-supported agriculture schemes where a box arrives from the farm every week and that kind of thing, and it's a very good one. The other thing that's happening in cutting-edge cities around the world is that we're returning to, above all, bicycles as a method of transportation. Copenhagen is now up to 40% commutes by bicycle. And that's a very good way to, nature is not just commuting under trees, it's being reminded that there are, elevation on the planet, and that gravity has a meaning. It's, being reminded that your body is a physical thing that can do lots of work. These are really good ways to try and build in some of what you're talking about, I think, into the urban experience, which has the great virtue in certain ways of being highly efficient. New York City is without any doubt the greenest city in the U.S., the greenest place in the U.S., simply because people live in relatively small apartments, and only an idiot would own a car in New York City. You know, people take transit where they're going, and so it's a very useful thing, and it can be made far more lovely on a day-to-day basis than it is, and people are starting to do those things.
Thank you. It's a great question, and it's one that I've wrestled with over the years, because I live in a city, a small city, but it is still a city.
Where do you live?
Chichester. And it's something, I think probably 10 years ago or so, I wanted to run off and be Hugh Fearnley-Whittington's mistress and follow him over to River Cottage and, you know, live the kind of life that he lives. And I fast realised, I didn't want to be his mistress, but that actually there were other ways of doing the kind of things that he does. So, and a lot of it is around food. So I grow my own vegetables, I rear my own pigs, I run a food cooperative, and what I've learned is that all of that has been done collaboratively. I live on a council estate in a terraced house. I couldn't do any of that in my own place, but I do it with other people. And I really think that the days of self-sufficiency and small holdings is over, because the majority of us can't do that. And actually, I don't think we want that anyway, because the kind of future that we're looking at needs us to be living together, working together, building strong community, building strong ties. And that has happened. I've got to know people through the kind of things that I do that I never would have happened if I'd gone off and lived on a plot of land somewhere. So that comes through cities. You take London, there's all sorts of vibrant stuff that's happening. You can Google growing communities and see the work that they're doing. Living in cities doesn't have to stop us from living in this kind of way. And I was really struck on a visit I did to Addis Ababa some years ago, and I used to do work with a group out there. And the lady who works in the slums there, she walked us around, firstly the area of the slums where they're not working, and then we went into the area where they do work, and a lot of it was similar. It was still looked quite bad. There were some changes, but one of the things I noticed was that outside all of the shacks were flowers and little gardens about this, you know, the width of this table. And I commented on that to her. Oh, isn't that nice? There are flowers. And she said, yes, she said it's one of the first things that people do when they begin to get some sense of self-worth and take some sort of responsibility. They want to plant a garden and have flowers. So that can happen right in the slums of Addis Ababa, and it's part of our connection, isn't it?
Okay, there's a lady there.
Yes, we at St Albans, we are a city centre church. Thank you. And our churchyard is closed. It's about an acre, so we planted an orchard in it, with a whole range of local varieties. We got the local youth offender teams to engage with planting them as part of the community payback scheme, in the hope that they will then come to strawberry apples in a couple of years' time. But my key point here, picking up the ideas about growing food in the city, is that St Albans has a food and drink festival which celebrates local food and drink. For the first time this year, we've joined this as a church, and we're organising an apple fair day, and we're going to have people showing how you can squeeze apples to make drinks and how you grow apple trees. And the local council is absolutely intrigued, and the mayor is fascinated. And I think we're setting a trend which hopefully will continue in the years ahead.
Calvay from NG Bailey. I wanted to ask Bill what you'd say to people who work in Exxon, or BP, or Shell, or the other people who are developing car shales and so on, to Christians working there who are trying to do the right thing. They're Christians, they believe in the kind of things you believe in, but they don't do what you do, they do it within Shell in whatever way they can. What would you say to them?
Well, I mean, I think it's obviously a very hard conversation. If you're willing to accept the science of climate change right now, working in fossil fuels is not a good way to be doing it, and to be doing anything right about the any more than working in a tobacco company is fit employment for someone who believes the science about public health. There are some very, very small parts of these companies indeed that are at work on renewable energy and things, but they're vanishingly small parts. British Petroleum restyled itself, as you recall, as Beyond Petroleum, and by all accounts spent far more money on the advertising about it than they did on the research on solar energy or anything else, and now they're back to being BP, and not even making the pretense, really. Look, I mean, frankly, what we need are conversions out of those industries. People leaving them and saying this is not fit work for me to be doing.
I was listening with great interest to what Bill was saying.
Could people introduce themselves with their names?
Yeah, my name is Mohammed Izzadin. I'm a reader in Islamic Studies at British and David University in London. And I wrote an environment, one book, a few books, one of them is Environmental Dimensions of Islam. And the question that come to my mind really is the American culture when we were talking. I mean, we probably can see different forms and shades of cultures in America. The American, Black American,
Yes.
Hispanic, and so on. And my question really is, how does this multicultural environment, and I assume multi-faith environment as well, reflect to the concept of sustainability? And I think particularly to the West, should the West learn from America, or should America learn from the West? I mean, I say that because quite often when there's a blackout in America, people in Europe start buying light bulbs.
The role of America as an example, as a kind of teacher to the rest of the world has been ruined. And it's been, and for a long time we didn't understand sort of why and what, and now we do. One of the things I spend a lot of my time doing when I'm in a place like China, talking with mayors of,
Shanghai.
we used to call provincial cities that are now cities that, there's 117 cities with more than 1 million people in China, just astonishing. And they're all in the business of, right now, of great growth and change. And one of the things I end up telling them often is, as you do this process, be careful who you look at. You don't want to model your city on the ones you see. Los Angeles is not a fit model going forward. Don't do it. Don't pay attention to Phoenix or Atlanta or Houston or the sort of go-go cities of the last 20 years in America. The cutting-edge cities that you need to look at right now are places like Copenhagen or Stockholm, or in the developing world, places like Curitiba in Brazil or things, which in many ways share certain characteristics with Chinese cities of 10 years ago, heavy bicycle traffic being one of them. The influence of the very high consumer society, deeply self-absorbed, highly individualistic, hyper-individualistic American culture has been baleful. America's given many gifts to the world, and some of them were the earlier version of that same thing. Our sense of individualism and freedom and liberty have been gifts to the planet as long as I was saying earlier this morning, they're on that, at that point in the spectrum where they make sense. But carried to the degree that they've been carried in the high consumer society of the U.S. in the last 30 or 40 years, they've become very poisonous gifts to the rest of the planet, and one that people should take care to inoculate themselves against to the degree they can. And the fact that America is one of its biggest exports over that period has been television and movie programs. And that's been the method of infection. That and the general agreement on tariff and trade and NAFTA. And that's why this has spread as quickly and powerfully as it has, I'm sure.
Thank you. We have about 20 minutes. Can I just have a general a desire for questions specifically focused on consumption? I'm mindful of the structure of this conference. We're going through particular themes, and it'd be quite easy, because all these areas are very interesting, to have a broad brush discussion on sustainability. But I'd like questions particularly with a consumption focus this morning. I'm going to start at the back there.
Rick Greenoff from De Montfort University. I think we can all agree in the room that overconsumption is a bad thing. There's no doubt about that. And yet we can probably all see things in our own lives that we enjoy consuming. My own particular idol is an Italian motorbike. My daughter's is shoes. My wife might be food, I think. And my son is his bass guitar. None of those things I would want to take off, any of us. So how can we draw the line? What guidelines can we use to say when our consuming of beauty in our lives has become idolatrous?
Well, I was thinking as Bill was asked at the end of your question session, Bill, you were, I think somebody was kind of skirting around the issue that you've flown here and fly a lot, and that there's obviously a huge environmental impact of flying. And you said two things, which I've been struggling to reconcile. You said on the one hand, well, at some level the maths has to come into it. At some level we have to balance on the one hand the benefit that you may achieve by actually being somewhere in person rather than virtually, with the environmental cost associated with your having flown there. And on the other hand, so much of what we've talked about today has been rooted in some sense of spirituality or intrinsic values or some sense of what is inherently right. Doesn't quite fit for me with the idea of us being able to impose a calculus on decisions like that and say, well, in this case, the carbon scales, if you like, tip in the direction of us of deciding to fly somewhere. So I'm wrestling with that, and I don't have an answer to it. But I suppose, as a corollary, part of it comes back to this question of what is it that underpins your appetite for your, is it a Harley? Your motorbike?
No, it's an old Ducati.
Your motorbike. And rather than beating yourself up, I suppose, about imagining that, well, this is something you ought, a source of pleasure that you ought to be doing without, there's another more contextual question about what is it societally that leads the ownership and use of a motorbike like that to convey the pleasure that it does. And obviously part of that is intrinsic, I guess. It's the wind in your hair. You've got as little hair as me, but it's the wind around your skull. And it's, I don't know, maybe it's the open road and a sense of even some sense of connection to nature, or being able to get out of the city. But also, perhaps it has something to do with a sense of prestige that comes with, that's associated with owning something like that. And
No, sometimes it's just looking at it.
or looking at it. So what factors in our cultural context are the ones which which drives that appetite. And for me, I think rather than beating yourself up as an individual over the fact that you have a gas guzzling motorbike parked in your garage.
It doesn't guzzle gas. Anyway, sorry.
Perhaps it ought rather be, the question we rather ought to be asking ourselves is, what in other aspects of my life am I doing which bears witness to those values, which champions those values, which shows some degree of courage, I suppose, or heroism, in terms of articulating those values, which you know over the course of time are going to have to come to underpin any societal shift away from expression of those appetites through the acquisition of a motorbike or some other high car.
And don't worry about it too much. I mean, if there's one thing in your life that you love and consume, that's fine. That's not a problem. I mean, in some ways, sort of the reverse. If it occupies you enough that, I mean, my great love in the entire world, you know, because of where I live, is cross-country skiing. That's what I do when there's snow. That's when I tend to be home, and so I have, like, because I race and all that, I have like 4 or 5 pairs of cross-country skis, and they're my pride and joy. But for 6 months of the year and a good year, that's like how I don't even hardly think or do anything else when there's it's a obsession like that is a perfectly good and a healthy thing, partly because it keeps you from doing the problem's not that. The problem's just recreational consumption of things to fill some hole in your life. If you've already filled that hole, why would anyone want anyone to give up their bass guitar if that was what they had spent their life doing? That's just the opposite, it seems to me. That strikes me as highly responsible consumption, where you figure out sort of what your heart, what makes you complete, and can go ahead and do it. So I wouldn't worry at all about that.
But I just want to come in. We might say, I don't want to single your wife out. There does seem to be a bit of a difference between the one-off purchase and the constant accumulation. So the shoes thing might be something that there is a bit of a debate around about how much is enough. Actually, leave the wife out of it, but I've got friends who are constantly buying more clothes and more shoes, and they would never ask themselves, have I got enough? It's just part of their habit of life. And there is a point, I think, at which we have to ask ourselves some questions over that. Actually, can I say I've got enough and I can now stop buying more things? And looking at where do the things come from? I hope with your motorbike you have a look into who's made it and into some of those issues. Where are our shoes from? So I think there's that side to it.
That's a good point, because there are things that we can't just keep consuming, and one of them is travel. To go to, and so when I was talking about the internet, one of the things that we're going to have to figure out how to do is increasingly travel by mouse rather than jet, as it were. You can make 1,000 Google searches for the amount of energy it takes to drive a kilometer. And so we're going to need to be substituting some of that. And frankly, I'm doing it myself more and more and more. I notice, last night and again tonight, I'll be, when everybody else has gone to bed, in here doing speeches to the U.S. via Skype video, which is now increasingly how I try to talk to people. And it's it's not perfect. It doesn't substitute completely for travel. This is better, but it's gets you 80% of the way there for virtually no energy at all.
One simple thing we all could do to address that question is to boycott all things made in China. Now, 60–70% of our goods in shops are made in China. How much transportation is required to bring things? And China requires raw materials going everywhere, Africa, South America, everywhere to get the raw material. How much transportation is needed? Then sending back. I was in Portugal. I went by train to Portugal, and it was a small town, 4 Chinese supermarkets in a small town south of Lisbon. So I think if you buy local, that's a good guideline. That gives you job to people and local economy and local products. So if you buy local, that's a good enough constraint and limit.
Thank you, Satish. Right, there are lots of hands up, and what I'm going to suggest we do is have 3 contributions and then get a panel to respond. If you keep your comments or questions quite brief, and that goes to the panelists as well as the speakers. I've got a gentleman in a check shirt there, I've got a gentleman in the front row there, I've got a gentleman up there, and then I'm going to look for some females, but I'm going to do that in the next round. So those 3 first of all. Thank you.
Thank you. Mark Coleman from Liverpool. Tom spoke about the opportunity of building common cause across groups, the donkey sanctuaries to the environmentalists, and looking, I'm a parish priest, vicar, and looking at the limited commitment in church to environmental issues, and seeing the potential for building common cause in the community, but struggling how to do it, looking for techniques really and tips, because I know there's been a lot of this around trade justice and other things. The big competing NGOs have got together a bit. How do we build common cause? I think faith groups on their own need to be re-evangelized by, in a sense, the secular world. There needs to be more conversation, at least between them. How do we do it? Techniques for building this common cause locally.
Okay, over the front.
Andrew Seddy from North Wales. Following on from Ruth's point just now about addictive behaviour, I wanted to draw some connections with food, since we're talking about consumption and obesity as a kind of an extended metaphor of the problem that we have. In terms of Llangollen, where I live, we recently tried a farmer's market, but while food is so much cheaper in the supermarkets, people are going to opt to shop there rather than just buy locally, and sadly they decided to call it a day after 6 months of the farmer's market, which raises the question about, after having been in France and seen the success of local markets there, what it is about the culture here that makes supporting farmers markets more of a challenge, and is it something to do with that supermarket culture that needs to be addressed?
Thank you, and right at the back. While the mic's going over there, a supplementary to Bill perhaps. My experience, I talked to Tom and until recently that were teaching out food undergraduates. My impression was that days of farmers' markets seemed to be sort of, I don't know, the curves would be a bit like that, and that like in Britain at least, they'd taken off, and many of them were not closing down. They maybe about 300 or so that were stable, but it wasn't much like a particular growth or expansion, and certainly I can't remember the figure, but we know that organic food is 2% of the market for food, so still very, very fringe. I'd be interested in the observations on whether the trend is still growing, Bill, but the market is doubtless there by now. So
Andy from Friends of the Earth, I apologise, I feel a bit like one of the old boys in the Muppets up in the balcony. It's an odd position to be in, but I'll try not to be too critical. But the question is this. It seems to me that all of us in this room are up for, and probably do practice, trying to reduce our consumption, but we're not winning. The scale at which we need to reduce consumption in society is huge. So my question is, what do we think is the priority? I don't have it's not that I have a preset answer to this, I'm really interested in your views. What's the priority and what do we do differently? And the options for priorities, which aren't mutually exclusive, but I think we perhaps need to pick one and really go for it, is change policy or get many, many more people just doing it. Either way, we're not winning, so we either have to campaign much more effectively together to change policy, or we need to do something that gets many, many more people fast reducing consumption. Of course, one will eventually affect the other, but what's the priority? And I guess my second question is, whichever way you go, how do we do it differently? And if I take the kind of getting more people on board, just reducing their consumption, as I said yesterday, I look around my own church community and know that there's only a handful of us, even within a faith group that says it believes in this stuff, that are actually doing it. So the starting point, it seems to me, has to be with our own faith groups. And what do we do differently to make it the norm, not the exception? Thinking of what Ruth was saying, so that Ruth feels normal, not abnormal, doing the things she wants to do. How do you make that change?
Thank you.
Who wants to panel greatly received?
Who wants to start?
Yeah, Bill? Well, look, these are all very good questions. It is a mathematical question at some level. If you had all the time in the world, it makes far more sense to proceed by changing your habits and encouraging other people to do so and working that slow cultural transformation. But it is by its nature slow. I was impressed a few years ago when right before the crash of 2008, in the highest point of the boom, gasoline prices in the U.S. topped $4 a gallon, which here would not be much, but in the U.S. was a strong psychological moment. And I've watched for 20 years as people had virtuously, including in the churches, campaigned against SUVs. I've run a reasonably successful little campaign that we did called "What Would Jesus Drive?" It was actually a little bit of scare into the Detroit. But in numerical terms, the minute that the price of gasoline was over $4 a gallon, that was the moment at which the market suddenly disappeared for people just figured out I don't need to be driving a military vehicle in order to do my things right. And it impressed on me the fact that if we're going to make change in the short amount of time, and we can talk about how short and why it is so short later if we want, but that physics and chemistry allows us, probably we're going to have to pull an economic lever that has something to do with the price of carbon. And the only way we can do that is through deep political fight, because on the other side stands the oil industry trying to make sure that lever doesn't get pulled. And so that's why our campaigning is getting more urgent and more confrontation. It's why people are now going to jail or things like that, and drawing much of our inspiration from stuff in the UK. We were really motivated by that successful campaign against the third runway at Heathrow. Not that that in and of itself is going to tip the balance, but hopefully these things over relatively short time will seed the ground where we get really momentous policy shift, and with that shift in behavior, just to, there was that excellent first slide that Ruth showed with that quote about, institutions, is it institutions or is it behavior? And I always think of Orwell's first, essay on Dickens, on whether or not it's virtuous human behavior or sort of ongoing shift, big shifts in institution that we need to produce the future. The answer is both, but to get those shifts in human behavior in large enough quantities to matter, it would be the most expeditious, and at this point perhaps the only realistic way we have left to do it is to get shifts in policy that then produce by the economic changes they were real shifts in human behavior.
Just very quickly, could you answer the point about Langdon and farmers markets?
Farmers markets continue to increase in the States in dramatic ways. Their number and in the States, less of this problem with, there's some people who say, oh, it's too high priced and things. A lot of schemes to kind of get around that. Now it's easy to use food stamps and things at farmers markets. The thing that's really getting around some of that is this use of CSA farms, community-supported agriculture farms, which actually turn out to be the cheapest way to buy vegetables over the course of the year. And it's interesting to note that in the States, the highest users of farmers markets, in percentage terms, the people most likely to use them, are recently arrived immigrants, legal and illegal, in the U.S. And I think there's two reasons for that. One is that they retain some sense of what food is supposed to taste like and are unwilling to accept the kind of simulations provided in the supermarket. And the other is they remain wedded to the pleasures of shopping in the company of their neighbors. And one of the things that's funniest about farmers markets and their success in the U.S. is the number of us patting ourselves on the back for coming up with this chic new idea. I mean, farmers markets is how everybody on Earth shopped for food until 70 years ago, and 70% of the planet still does. And of course we like it, that's what we're evolved to. Supermarkets have figured out how to provide food very cheaply, too cheaply. And in the world that we built, that's become their only virtue. And as that planet, as our planet gets poorer, and as more and more people have less and less, then that becomes a kind of self-reinforcing tendency. And figuring out how to break that is very, very key.
Thank you.
I would like to just address briefly Andy's question. I don't think we need to choose between one or the other. I would say one and the other, rather than one or the other. And coming from India and being inspired by Mahatma Gandhi, he said, be the change you want to see in the world. Because your words and your actions and your protest will have integrity and power if you practice it. If we don't live what we preach and what we campaign for, then there will be no power in our words. So Mahatma Gandhi had that power because he practiced what he preached. And then he could organize, communicate, and build a big movement for independence of India. So I think we can build a big movement, a strong movement, if we practice and campaign, and communicate, and share. If 100 people communicate with 10 other people, there will be 1,000 people. And those 1,000 people communicating with 10 other people, with 10,000 people. So we have to build that movement, but be the change you want to see in the world. Just words will not create a big campaign. It's the practice which will give you the power. So I think there's no contradiction between one or the other. We need both simultaneously. One cannot survive without the other. Just practicing, not enough. Just campaigning, not enough. You have to do both. If you do one or the other, you will not succeed.
Let me pick up on the other couple of questions. The question about the church and community, I'm not saying this is the answer as such, but certainly one way I know a lot of people have found to have that connection has been through the Transition Towns movement, something that I'm very involved with, brought me into contact with all sorts of people. My only regret is that all of the activities that are happening in my transition town is being done by Transition Chichester, it's not being done by my church. I look at what the transition movement is doing, and I think that just should be such a natural thing for the church to be doing. But I found that a great connection. So I'd have a look at that, see if there's one near you. I'm sure there are other things as well. The question about the farmers market and Wales is a fantastic question. I don't know how on earth we can answer it quickly, because it brings up the whole food culture that we have got in this country. And France has been very different. It is still much more localised and still much more regionally based. Although it has its supermarkets, it is still has much more of a market culture than we do. And obesity is a huge problem. I don't know if you saw recently in the papers, it was saying globally there are now more obese people than there are starving people. It's a horrendous statistic to see coming through. I would want to question whether food bought in that way is cheaper. I think cheap processed food from the supermarket is cheaper, but that actually is a false economy, not just because of environmental factors that aren't brought in, but actually just from the nutritional perspective. I have quite a kind of strong food ethic and do my best to shop in a way that follows that ethic. We have survived on a budget for pretty much all of our married life, and I know, and we eat very well, and I know that our food budget is less than my friends who buy all of their food from the supermarket. One of the main differences, well, I think it comes down to two things. One of the main things is processed food. A lot of the expense is in processed food. The other is in meat. A lot of the expense is in meat. And having a diet, I'm not vegetarian, but having a diet that doesn't eat as much meat and predominantly eats the cheaper cuts has brought the budget down. I think it comes down also to questions in our culture about education and food. Do people actually know how to cook? Do they know how to make the most of goods, so they know how to go to a market and buy things that are going to last. You look at the statistics that we throw away 30% of our food. I mean, that's just ridiculous. So much I could say into that, but our food culture, because we have let the supermarkets dominate us, has been our ruin, I think.
Thank you. Can I just, we're running out of time. Tom hasn't had a chance to speak. Tom.
Well, there was one question which was directed at me. I suppose I just don't feel as though the canvas that we're having this discussion on is big enough. We gravitate back to asking how do we motivate particular behaviours. We focus on particular issues. How do we motivate people to buy food from a farmer's market, for example? And that's the way the third sector has approached these issues, in a piecemeal fashion, asking what are the high carbon behaviours, what motivates people to do it, how can we try to make it easier for them to do something else. But people's shopping habits, their willingness to buy organic food, their willingness to buy fair trade food, and maybe, I haven't seen the study, if there is one, but I'd anticipate their willingness to buy food that's produced locally, is rooted in their values. There's a strong correlation there. Their willingness to engage in political activism, of the type that Andy was saying we need more of, is rooted in their values. Their sense of unity with nature, their willingness to cycle, is rooted in their values. And we know that there are a whole range of things which are eroding the importance that we attach on those values, which underpin, across the board, many of those issues, which brings me to the question I was specifically asked of, okay, so what do we do with that insight? And I think what we do with that insight is not to tear up what we're already doing and saying, well, we're going to each go and work on, some common campaign, but rather we recognise that in the course of doing what we do, in the course of focusing on the issues that are important to us, for the organisation I work on, it's biodiversity conservation, and will remain biodiversity conservation, we need also to be keeping an eye on what values we're simultaneously serving to reinforce in the course of running those campaigns. And at the moment, I think I can say this with some conviction for the third sector, we're not nearly sufficiently savvy about what those values are, and we're far too willing to be instrumentalists in appealing to values which in the short term may help in addressing particular issues, but which simultaneously undermine our progress on the overall piece.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all your contributions and questions. We have run out of time, so I know there are others waiting to speak, but I'm afraid we must end up. But before you go, Colin has a couple of announcements.
Yes, thank you, Tim. Another very stimulating session. You'll be pleased to know that we are recording all the sessions and we'll be posting both audio and video on the Faraday website in a few weeks' time. So you can come back and listen to them again and get new insights and also share them with your friends and colleagues who can't be here. And we will also be selling copies of them on CD and DVD. All the details will be emailed to you after the conference when things are ready. The second thing to say is that something else we hope will happen after the conference is that all the conversations that are happening will continue. We have all your email addresses for plugging in. We would like to be able to distribute them to other delegates, but we must have your permission to do so, for obvious reasons. So on the bookstall, there is a list of all your names, and basically a box to tick saying you are happy for your email address to be shared with other people, and also to sign up for the Clients from Faraday mailing lists, emailing lists, to get further information on our activities. So please go to the bookstore and tick your name there. The next session starts at 2 o'clock. Thank you for being prompt to this one. And we hope you'll be prompt for the next one to hear Juliet Davenport. Lunch is a buffet served outside. We have a mixture of vegetarian and perhaps more radical food. Help yourselves. Those who have a special diet of any form, please tell one of the catering staff and they have special food for you. Thank you.
And so can I wrap the session up by asking you to, inviting you to the